Hello, my friend. Thank you for joining me on this quiet night. Before we dive deep into today's mystery, I want to invite you to get comfortable. If you enjoy exploring the unknown as much as I do, please consider tapping that like button and subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue these late night journeys. And let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it as you join me on this adventure? I'm always amazed at how far and wide our little midnight community reaches. Now, imagine the scene. The house lights are low. Maybe you've got a warm drink in hand. And outside, beyond your window, the world has fallen silent. In that deep silence, your mind starts to wander. Perhaps you hear the faint echo of waves in the distance. Or maybe that's just your heartbeat. You close your eyes and picture a vast, dark ocean stretching out to the horizon. Somewhere beneath those gentle waves, hidden under ages of myth and salt, something stirs in your imagination. A lost city, glittering spires toppled and drowned, ancient secrets swirling in the currents. The lost city of Atlantis. Just saying the name feels like a spell, doesn't it? Atlantis. A word that conjures images of an advanced civilization, shining temples and gleaming canals, suddenly swallowed by the sea in a single catastrophic night. It's a story that's haunted humanity for over 2,000 years, whispered about by philosophers, explorers, and dreamers alike. But was Atlantis ever real, or is it just the greatest legend ever told? That question has tugged at our collective curiosity generation after generation. And tonight, under the gentle cloak of darkness, we're going to unravel this tale together, piece by piece. Think about why this legend captivates us so much. Is it the tragedy of it? An entire world lost overnight, like a candle blown out by the wind? Or is it the possibility, however remote, that somewhere out there, under the sea, remnants of this glorious city might still be waiting for someone to discover them? The mystery of Atlantis touches something deep within us, our longing for wonder, our hope that perhaps myths carry a seed of truth, and maybe, just maybe, that we haven't uncovered all the marvels of our world yet. So, in this comfortable stillness, let's journey back in time and across oceans. Let's sail beyond the pillars of Hercules and into the unknown, following the faint trail of clues left by ancient storytellers and modern seekers alike. We'll begin at the very beginning of the legend, in the halls of ancient Greece, where the tale was first whispered. We'll walk through the grand narrative of Atlantis' rise and fall, immerse ourselves in the vivid details of its splendor and destruction. Then we'll surface for a reality check to ask the tough questions: how much of this story could actually be true? And finally, we'll reflect on why this myth endures, what it tells us about ourselves, our dreams, and our fears. Stay with me as we delve into the lost city of Atlantis, real or myth. This is not just a history lesson, but a midnight meditation on mystery and meaning. Ready? Take a deep breath and let's dive in. To understand Atlantis, we have to begin not under the ocean, but in an ancient conversation 2.5 millennia ago. Imagine yourself in Athens around 360 BC. The air is warm, and the agora is quieting down for the evening. In a small courtyard, the philosopher Plato is hosting a philosophical supper with friends. Oil lamps flicker as Plato's guests exchange stories and ideas. Socrates is there. Yes, that's Socrates, along with a wise statesman named Critias and a traveler named Timaeus. They're discussing what the perfect society might look like, an idea Plato had explored in his work, The Republic. Socrates challenges them, essentially asking, can we imagine a story of a great nation that puts these ideals into practice. At this, the old man Critias leans forward, a strange gleam in his eye. He says, slowly, that he knows of a tale, a true story. He claims of a mighty empire and its downfall. It's a tale passed down in his family for generations. His grandfather heard it from the great Athenian lawmaker Solon, and Solon, in turn, learned it from Egyptian priests on his travels. Critias insists that this isn't a mere fable, but history recorded by Egyptians 9,000 years ago, long before Athens or any city they know. Picture Solon, around 590 BC, visiting a temple in the Egyptian city of Sais. The walls are covered in hieroglyphs. The air smells of incense and dust. An elderly priest points to an inscription and gently chides Solon, saying, "You Greeks are but children. You remember only one flood, but there were many." Then the priest begins to recount an astounding story. 9. Is 0 years before that time, which would be about 600 years ago from our present day, there existed an island beyond the edges of the known world. It lay past the Pillars of Heracles, the narrow strait you and I know as the Strait of Gibraltar, the gateway from the calm Mediterranean to the vast, mysterious Atlantic Ocean. In that great ocean, the priest says, there was once a mighty island as large as Libya and Asia Minor put together, a land called Atlantis. This island was no primitive place. It was an empire, wealthy and technologically advanced. A kingdom blessed by the sea god, Poseidon himself. Atlantis ruled over numerous other islands, and even parts of the continents. Its power reached into the Mediterranean, conquering lands as far as Egypt and Italy, imposing its might on the world. For generations, Atlantis prospered, a dazzling realm of canals and palaces, elephants and exotic fruits, bronze and gold. It was a utopia, at least at first, a place of abundance and wisdom. So the story goes. But now the priest's voice lowers. He speaks of hubris, of the Atlanteans growing prideful, greedy, and corrupt. Their ambition grew too great. They set their sights on Athens and the rest of the known world. And so, from across the sea, a vast Atlantean fleet came crashing in like a storm. Here in the tale, ancient Athens becomes the unexpected hero, the small, brave city-state that stands alone against this giant empire. In Plato's telling, the Athenians, his own people's ancestors, somehow fight off the Atlantean invasion, overcoming impossible odds. It's as if the stage is set for a grand triumph of the little guy over the superpower. And then, fate intervenes. The gods grow weary of Atlantis' arrogance. As Critias relays the story, a devastating punishment is sent from the heavens. Imagine the ground trembling violently. Far across the sea, the priests described how Atlantis was struck by a series of terrible earthquakes and floods, nature itself rising up in fury. And in a span of a single day and night, just one day and night of unthinkable calamity, the great island of Atlantis, its people, its palaces, its entire glory, sank beneath the waves and vanished, swallowed by the sea. In the aftermath, all that remained was a vast expanse of mud and shallow shoals, where a proud kingdom had been, an impassable quagmire that made the ocean unnavigable for years to come. Plato sets this story up with remarkable detail for a true history no one else had heard of. He even gives us dates and lineage. He anchors it in real people like Solon, ties it to real places like Egypt and Athens, and insists the events occurred 0 years before, a timeline that would place Atlantis in a prehistoric epoch long before any known civilization. By framing it this way, Plato's account feels tantalizingly plausible, almost like a legend waiting in a dusty archive to be rediscovered. Some have even speculated Atlantis was a memory of the mysterious sea peoples who wrought havoc in the Mediterranean around 1200 BC, recast in Plato's tale. It's an interesting thought, though the timeline and details don't match perfectly. Yet, interestingly, the story never actually finishes in Plato's writings. In his dialogue, Craze, just as Zeus, king of the gods, is about to pronounce judgment on Atlantis, the manuscript ends abruptly, a cliffhanger in the truest sense. Did Plato purposely leave it unfinished to spark our imagination, or did he simply not complete it? We don't know. What we do know is that this abrupt ending leaves Atlantis's final fate, and the lessons to be drawn from it lingering in the air, unresolved, like a question echoing across the ages. But afterwards, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis, in like manner, disappeared in the depths of the sea. Plato. Timaeus. So there, we have our stage set, an ancient philosopher's tale of a golden empire lost to the sea. It's a rich, vivid story, full of grandeur and catastrophe. Atlantis, in Plato's own words, was an extraordinary dream of a civilization. Perhaps too extraordinary. But before we judge what it is, legend or memory or myth, we need to dive deeper into the details. What exactly made Atlantis so mesmerizing in Plato's account? And how did this story go from an obscure philosophical dialogue to one of the greatest mysteries of all time? Let's step fully into the world of Atlantis, as described by Plato and those who followed. Let's wander its imagined palaces and ports, then trace the path of the legend as it escaped Plato's scrolls and captured the world's imagination. Our journey into the body of the Atlantis story begins, painting a picture of the lost city in all its glory, and following the ripples it sent through history. Now that the scene is set, let's immerse ourselves in Atlantis itself, and then follow the long journey this legend has taken through human history. We'll explore the rich details of the Atlantis story as told by Plato, wander through the halls of that lost city in our mind's eye, and then trace how this myth refused to stay buried. It's a tale with many twists, historical theories, wild speculation, earnest expeditions, and personal obsessions. Along the way, I'll share some reflections of my own. Moments when I felt the pull of Atlantis, or when reality reminded me to keep my feet on the ground. This is the layered story of a myth that just won't quit. Now, I have a small confession. The legend of Atlantis has always tugged at me personally. I remember being a child, flipping through a colorful encyclopedia and stumbling on an illustration of Atlantis, gleaming domes and towers under the sea, a whole world lost to time. That image imprinted on my mind. I daydreamed about finding a secret map or diving to discover marble columns on the ocean floor. Perhaps you have a similar memory or feeling, that thrill of possibility that maybe, just maybe, a part of this story could be true. It's that very feeling that has driven so many people in our story to go searching and to add their own layers to the tale of Atlantis. Close your eyes for a moment and visualize Atlantis, not as ruins, but as a living city at its zenith. The sun is rising over a vast central island, casting golden light on a city unlike any other. You're hovering above an incredible harbor. Below you, concentric rings of land and sea coil outwards like a target, alternating water. En esa momento, seamen guiris triu Grertiorv. These rings are man-made canals encircling the central hill where a palace gleams. Bridges connect the rings like spokes of a wheel, and every waterway is bustling with ships. It's as if Venice and Babylon had a wondrous oceanic child, a city of rings and waterways, designed for both beauty and defense. But at the heart of Atlantis, on the central island hill, stands the grand temple of Poseidon. Its roofs might be flashing with coppery red in the sun. The metal orichalcum, second only to gold in value, covers much of the temple's walls. Inside, there is said to be a colossal statue of Poseidon driving 6 winged horses, a monument to the god who, according to legend, founded this city. Poseidon's presence is everywhere in Atlantis. After all, he was believed to have fathered its first rulers. The story goes that Poseidon fell in love with a mortal woman, Plato, on this very hill, when the island was a wild abode of lush forests and springs. To protect her, Poseidon surrounded her home with the rings of water by his divine power, and over time, their 10 sons became the 10 kings of Atlantis. The eldest son, Atlas, gave the island and the encircling ocean its name, and his younger twin and other brothers ruled various parts of the island and beyond. From our bird's eye view, you can see the great plain of Atlantis stretching to the south of the city. It's enormous and fertile, neatly divided by a grid of canals for irrigation, glittering like blue ribbons in the morning light. This plain, Plato says, was the heartland of the Atlantean kingdom. Imagine vast fields of grain, orchards heavy with fruit, herds of cattle, and yes, even elephants roaming. The climate was so gentle and rich that even elephants thrived there, a detail Plato amusingly mentions. Beyond the plain, mountains rise in the distance, hugging the northern edges of the island. Their slopes, harboring waterfalls that feed the plain's canals. The city itself is a marvel of engineering. The rings of land are walled, and not just with bare stone, but with metal-clad fortifications that catch the sun. One ring's wall shines with the glint of copper, another with the cool, pale gleam of tin, and the innermost wall of the citadel is said to be covered in orichalcum, reflecting a fiery glow. As you descend lower into the city, you'd hear the sounds of a great metropolis awakening, merchants calling out in a busy marketplace where goods from all over the known world and beyond are traded. Exotic spices, gleaming jewels, and colorful parrots from distant lands. Atlantis, in our mind's eye, is the cosmopolitan hub of the ancient world that Plato envisioned. Aqueducts bring fresh water down from the mountains, while an enormous canal, wider than anything the Greeks had ever built, cuts through the rings, connecting the inner harbor to the sea. This canal is so wide that triremes, the warships of the ancient Mediterranean, could sail in side by side. We can imagine ships with billowing sails moving through the waterways, their hulls laden with treasures, gold, spices, ivory, and maybe strange artifacts from lands we've never heard of. If your senses aren't overwhelmed yet, consider the harbor at the outermost ring, a forest of masts and sails, the air thick with salt, and the calls of sailors in a dozen tongues. Atlantis, at peace, must have been a thriving, multicultural metropolis. But there is order amid this splendor. The 10 kings of Atlantis meet regularly, perhaps in a grand council chamber lined with orichalcum and ivory. They discuss laws and justice. Plato describes an elaborate legal code and a ritual where each king swears to uphold the laws by sacrificing a bull in Poseidon's temple. In the early days, these kings governed wisely and justly, and Atlantis was a paradise of harmony and prosperity. Imagine lush gardens, fountains, and gymnasiums where philosophers might debate under colonnades. Is it too far-fetched to picture Atlantean philosophers? Perhaps Plato doesn't mention that, but let's indulge a little. The common folk are healthy and content, nourished by the island's bounty. Art and science flourish. Maybe Atlantean scholars chart the stars from observatories atop those mountains, or engineers invent wondrous devices powered by water, and perhaps the mysterious energy of the orichalcum metal. For a moment, it almost feels real, doesn't it? Walking the polished stones of Atlantis' streets in our imagination, one can't help but feel a pang of envy for this lost world. It's utopian, yet alive. Not some static, perfect, boring place, but a vibrant civilization at the peak of its powers. Plato wanted us to be impressed by Atlantis' greatness so that its fall would truly hit home as a lesson, and impressed we are. However, even in this idyllic vision, you might sense a shadow looming. Perhaps as you wander the bustling markets and sunlit docks, you overhear anxious whispers. Talk of the kings, growing overly ambitious, of armies being built, of distant nations falling under Atlantis' dominion. The very prosperity and might that made Atlantis glorious are pushing it towards arrogance. In Plato's account, the rot sets in, imperceptibly, generation by generation. The Atlanteans begin to change, forgetting the humble ways of life that Poseidon had taught their ancestors. Greed and pride creep in like a slow high tide. One imagines golden statues being erected to glorify the kings, or generals boasting that no power on earth could ever challenge Atlantis. It is the classic setup, the seeds of downfall being sown in the midst of triumph. Let's shift perspective and imagine ourselves right at the climax of the legend. The very day Atlantis was destroyed. Storytellers have glossed over the details for centuries, but in the spirit of a late-night tale, we can try to experience it. If only in our minds. It's dawn in Atlantis. The city that has stood for millennia wakes up to a day like any other. Fishermen are rowing out through the great canal to the open sea. Merchants are opening their shop stalls in the ring market, and priests are climbing the steps of Poseidon's temple to greet the morning sun. Perhaps a few people notice that the animals are uneasy, horses stamping, birds unusually silent, but the skies are clear, and the empire is at the height of its power. Why worry? Across the sea, in Athens, this day might feel different. The Athenians have been on edge, rallying their forces after miraculously halting the Atlantean onslaught. In Plato's story, Athens stood virtually alone against Atlantis' might. Picture a battered Athenian general looking out from the city walls at the enemy camp. Maybe he expected the war to resume at first light with a final, desperate battle. But something is off. A tremor in the ground, a distant rumble, like heavy stones rolling deep beneath the earth. Back in Atlantis, that faint tremor becomes a roar. Breakfast bowls clatter off tables. The ground ripples violently. Brick walls crack. In the harbor, water begins to withdraw unnaturally, leaving fish flapping in the mud. A sure sign, though they didn't know it, of an impending tsunami. People shout in confusion. Some think the gods must be angry. Others perhaps suspect a freak earthquake. Within minutes, multiple quakes hit in succession, so strong that the massive bronze walls of the city start to buckle. Imagine the three circular moats sloshing out of their banks, waves of water crashing into the inner city. Ships in the canal are tossed like toys. On the streets, panic. Families clutch each other as statues of kings topple and colonnades collapse. The sky might still be clear blue, but the world is coming apart underfoot. From the temple of Poseidon, high on the central hill, priests and bystanders can see far to the south. And what they see is terrifying. A gigantic wall of water on the horizon, racing toward the island. The sea that was momentarily sucked away has come surging back with a vengeance. It's a tsunami, taller than any wave humans had ever seen. There's barely time to scream before it hits the outer rings of the city with an earth-shattering crash. Timber buildings, even stone structures, are swept clean off the land rings. The force is so great, it breaches the mighty walls. Water pours into the city's heart like an open floodgate. We can imagine an Atlantean nobleman clinging to a fragment of a broken column, watching incredulously as his world literally sinks. Perhaps he catches a glimpse of the royal palace one last time, its proud towers tilting, then sliding under foaming, debris-choked water. The sound must be a cacophony. Roaring waves, the grinding crunch of buildings giving way, the cries of thousands of people echoing across the din. And then, perhaps within the span of mere hours, Atlantis, the jewel of the world, is gone. The great island has vanished beneath churning waters. Where once there were fertile plains and glittering cities, now there is just a turbulent sea littered with floating timbers and the wreckage of an entire civilization. Across the waves in Greece, the Athenians feel the earthquakes and later are buffeted by strange surges in the sea. They realize something catastrophic happened out in the west. As Plato says, in one grievous day and night, Atlantis was no more, and with it, their own army of heroes was swallowed by the earth as well. The war ended not with a victor, but with nature casting the final judgment. Silence follows. Days later, when the oceans calm and curious survivors sail to where Atlantis had been, they find nothing recognizable. Perhaps some new shoals, where the sea is strangely shallow. Clogged by mud, sailors would likely avoid that area thereafter. It was said to be unnavigable, haunted by the submerged ruins below. This imagined scene drives home the emotional core of the Atlantis story. It's not just the loss of a city. It's the obliteration of a whole world in a blink. For those who heard this tale in ancient times, it must have been chilling and awe-inspiring. The fall of Atlantis is like the ultimate tragedy writ large, something that feels both fantastical and yet eerily plausible, given that many ancient cultures had memories of floods and quakes. It's no wonder that the story lingered. How do you forget an image like that? Proud Atlantis, punished by the cosmos and sunk forever. It's the kind of story that etches itself into collective memory, whether or not it really happened. Now, as we shake off this harrowing mental image, we transition from the mythic past back to our journey through history. Atlantis's fall, as vivid as we made it, is essentially a legendary moment. We step back into the shoes of curious historians and adventurers who, centuries later, would find themselves enthralled by this very scene and wonder, could it have been real? And if so, where are its traces? With that climactic tale in mind, let's continue tracing the ripple effect Atlantis had on later ages. How this dramatic end fueled endless new beginnings in the imaginations of those who heard it. The story of Atlantis, as captivating as it was, could easily have been forgotten as just another philosophical allegory. And for a long time, it nearly was. After Plato's death, his followers and later Greek historians didn't all embrace the tale as literal truth. The ancient philosopher Aristotle, who knew Plato well, is rumored to have smirked. Plato is the one who invented Atlantis, and he also destroyed it, implying he thought it was a fiction. Other writers in antiquity occasionally mentioned Atlantis, but often with a skeptical tone. The great geographer Strabo, centuries later in Roman times, noted the story only to say that those who take Plato's Atlantis as historical truth seem to be misusing his work. In short, the learned of the classical world largely treated Atlantis as an intriguing story or allegory, not a chapter of real history. Yet, the allure never completely died, like an ember that glows quietly under ash, waiting for the right moment to burst into flame. The Atlantis myth bided its time. Fast forward to the age of exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries. Europeans set sail beyond the known seas and, lo and behold, they found entirely new lands, the Americas. This was a seismic shock to the old worldview. Suddenly, it didn't seem so impossible that there might have been unknown continents or islands in the ocean. Minds turned back to ancient sources for hints of others who might have crossed the seas. Could Plato's Atlantis have been a premonition of the New World? Some thinkers began to speculate that Atlantis wasn't in the distant past at all, but rather that Plato's tale was a garbled memory of lands across the Atlantic, the very ones now being encountered. In 1627, the English philosopher Francis Bacon published a novel titled The New Atlantis. While Bacon's story was more about an ideal society of scientists on a fictional island, the title shows how Atlantis had become shorthand for a hidden utopian land. Around the same time, Spanish chroniclers like Francisco López de Gomara suggested that the indigenous peoples of the Americas might be descendants of Atlantis, and that the lost island was a poetic way of talking about lands west of the Atlantic. The idea was adventurous. Perhaps Atlantis had been hiding in plain sight as the Americas themselves. These were speculative leaps, of course, with no real evidence, but they indicate how the discovery of new lands breathed new life into an old myth. Interestingly, in trying to explain Atlantis, some early thinkers stumbled towards real scientific insights. For instance, the Flemish geographer Abraham Ortelius speculated in 1596 that the Americas and Europe-Africa were once joined and then torn apart by floods, essentially anticipating the idea of continental drift as a way to explain Atlantis's disappearance. He was right about the continents drifting, but wrong about Atlantis being the cause. By the 17th century, maps of the world were improving, but that didn't stop a few scholars from trying to put Atlantis on them. Enter Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit scholar and polymath, who in 1669 included a curious map in one of his books. Athanasius Kircher's map of Atlantis, drawn in 1669, places the island in the mid-Atlantic Ocean, with south at the top. It reflects how even scholarly minds of that era tried to literalize Plato's story on a map. Kircher's own illustration shows Atlantis as a sizable continent bridging the Atlantic between the old and new worlds, with only a few islands like the Azores remaining above water after the cataclysm. Kircher's map shows Atlantis as a small continent in the Atlantic, neatly filling that oceanic gap on the world chart. It's fascinating to see a scholar of Kircher's stature taking the legend so earnestly as to draw it out. Clearly, Atlantis was not just a fireside story. It was becoming a subject of proto-scientific inquiry, or at least enthusiastic conjecture. Still, these early theories were relatively restrained compared to what came next. The real explosion of Atlantis mania came in the 19th century. This was an era when archaeology was young, and lost civilizations were being unearthed in the sands of Egypt and Mesopotamia, fueling imaginations everywhere. In 1870, archaeologists discovered the ruins of ancient Troy, a city long thought mythical from Homer's epics, proving that sometimes legends had a basis in fact. If Troy was real, why not Atlantis? Enter a former congressman named Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. In 1882, Donnelly published a book that would single-handedly revive Atlantis fever for the modern world. Atlantis, the antediluvian world. Donnelly was not a professionally trained archaeologist. Few in that day truly were. But he was a passionate researcher of sorts. He combed through myths and folklore from around the world, from Mayan legends to Indian Vedas, looking for anything that resembled the tale of a great flood or a sunken land. He became convinced that Plato's Atlantis was not just real, but the key to understanding all of human history. Donnelly argued that Atlantis was nothing less than the mother culture that seeded the great civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Europe, and the Americas. According to him, when Atlantis sank, its survivors spread out and carried knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, architecture, writing, you name it, to the rest of the world, hence the parallel pyramids in Egypt and Mesoamerica, and other such coincidences. It was a bold, romantic idea, appealing to that 19th century sense of a lost golden age. Donnelly's vision of Atlantis was practically a lost continent, a huge mid-Atlantic landmass that perished in a disaster around 10 to 12,000 years ago, dovetailing with the timing of the biblical flood, which he, like many of his contemporaries, took as a real event. He gathered what he claimed was evidence, shared legends of floods, certain words in different languages that he thought had a common root in Atlantean language, and the distribution of similar plant and animal species across continents. Much of this evidence was circumstantial or coincidental, but it was presented in an engaging way. People ate it up. Suddenly, Atlantis wasn't just a dusty tale. It was on the front pages of newspapers and the lips of explorers. A world map from Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, 1882, illustrating his concept of an Atlantean empire. Donnelly imagined Atlantis as a large continent bridging the Atlantic, whose people spread civilization to Eurasia and the Americas before the island was swallowed by the sea. His publication ignited a frenzy of speculation about Atlantis in the late 19th century. Donnelly's work ignited a craze. If Atlantis had given rise to Egypt and Maya and others, then finding Atlantis would be like discovering the Holy Grail of history. It would rewrite the story of human civilization. The public was enthralled by this idea of a lost super-civilization, and some early scientists and adventure seekers took it quite seriously. 2. Archaeology was still figuring out its methods, and grand diffusionist ideas like Donnelly's were not yet entirely beyond the pales. The legacy of Donnelly can't be overstated. His book remained continuously in print for decades and inspired generations of Atlantis enthusiasts. We see his influence carry into the early 20th century, with some rather imaginative successors. For example, the Theosophical Society, a spiritualist movement led by Helena Blavatsky, wove Atlantis into their mystical teachings. They claimed that Atlanteans were not only real, but were the fourth root race of humanity, towering, psychic beings with advanced technology and supernatural powers. According to these occult histories, Atlantis had airships and energy crystals, and its people could communicate via telepathy. But they ultimately fell into decadence and sorcery, leading to their downfall. Wild stuff, right? It was basically Atlantis meets science fiction and fantasy, except presented as occult history. This was not mainstream by any means, but it had a devoted following and further cemented Atlantis as a fixture in the popular imagination. Even less esoteric writers continued to churn out Atlantis theories. In 1924, researcher Lewis Spence published Atlantis in the Atlantic, reasserting the case for a real submerged Atlantic continent and compiling many reported finds, most of which were dubious or misinterpreted of ancient artifacts supposedly dredged from the ocean. A few years later, Edgar Cayce, a famous American sleeping prophet, claimed to have psychic readings of Atlantis. Cayce confidently described a technologically advanced Atlantis with power crystals and firestone energy devices, and said that parts of Atlantis would rise again in the 1960s. He specifically predicted that evidence of Atlantis would be found near the island of Bimini in the Bahamas in 1968 or 1969. As we'll see, that prophecy would later add fuel to an interesting coincidence. Not all interest in Atlantis was harmless dreamery. There were darker appropriations too. In the late 1930s and 1940s, fringe theorists in Nazi Germany latched onto Atlantis as well, spinning tales that the Atlanteans were racially pure Aryans, and that after their island sank, they founded the Aryan or Nordic peoples. It was pseudo-historical nonsense, but it appealed to the Nazi ideologues who were eager to fabricate a grand ancient pedigree for their so-called master race. Thus, a myth used by Plato to illustrate moral philosophy was twisted into propaganda for one of the most destructive ideologies in history. It's a sobering reminder that myths have power. They can inspire wonder and creativity, but in the wrong hands, they can also feed dangerous fantasies. Atlantis, adaptable as it is, became whatever different groups wanted it to be. A cautionary tale, a source of spiritual wisdom, or a tool of extremist ideology. After World War II, Atlantis shrugged off that ugly episode and returned to its role as our favorite lost civilization. In the latter 20th century, it fully entered pop culture as a genre of its own. Think of every trope of ancient advanced civilizations in books and movies. There's a good chance they owe something to Atlantis. From the submerged cities in comic books, Aquaman's Kingdom of Atlantis, to the animated Disney film Atlantis, The Lost Empire. The legend permeates storytelling. If you grew up playing video games or watching adventure movies, you likely encountered some Atlantean lore. Perhaps an Atlantean artifact with mysterious powers, or an episode of a sci-fi show where Atlantis is an alien outpost under the ocean. The myth is just so flexible. It's the ultimate story canvas, where we project our fantasies of hidden knowledge, prehistoric glory, and cataclysmic downfall. In modern entertainment, Atlantis has practically become shorthand for any mysterious lost realm. Countless novels, comics, and films have riffed on it. In the DC comic universe and recent blockbuster films, Atlantis is a literal underwater kingdom, ruled by Aquaman. The 2001 Disney animated film Atlantis, The Lost Empire, reimagined Atlanteans with flying machines and crystal power sources, clearly nodding to those theosophical ideas of high technology. Earlier, in 1913, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, of Sherlock Holmes fame, wrote a story called The Maricot Deep, featuring explorers who encounter surviving Atlanteans on the ocean floor. The theme inspired early science fiction and fantasy across Europe and America. For example, the French author Jules Verne had Captain Nemo visit sunken Atlantis in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The name even found its way into music. A famous 1968 song by singer Donovan poetically narrates the tale of Atlantis' submergence, and its chorus, "Way down below the ocean," became an earworm for a generation. This popular culture afterlife of Atlantis is more than just fun trivia. It shows how the story has been continuously reborn to suit each era's imagination. We mold Atlantis into what we need it to be: a cautionary tale, a cool fantasy setting, a metaphor for lost knowledge, or even a whimsical adventure backdrop. The lost city's name carries such weight that it instantly evokes mystery and depth. Whether you encounter it in a scholarly debate or a Saturday morning cartoon, few ancient myths have proven as versatile or enduring. Atlantis, as an idea, adapts and thrives, even if the city itself never physically did. Atlantis has journeyed from an ancient philosophical anecdote to a modern myth that continuously evolves. Each generation finds something in it: a caution, a hope, a thrill. With the legend popularized and re-energized, the 20th and 21st centuries saw a plethora of attempts to find Atlantis, or at least to find a place that could have inspired the tale. This is where the line between sincere archaeology and romantic adventure often blurred. For every serious hypothesis grounded in evidence, there were a dozen wild goose chases spurred by a mixture of hope, misinterpretation, and sometimes outright fantasy. Yet, each search, successful or not, adds a chapter to the Atlantis saga. Let's look at some of the intriguing and occasionally bizarre expeditions and hypotheses that have emerged. One of the earliest and most compelling ideas was that Atlantis might be linked to the Minoan civilization of the Aegean Sea, a real Bronze Age civilization that flourished on Crete and nearby islands. The Minoans were advanced for their time circa 2000–1500 BC, with beautiful palaces, writing, and seafaring trade. The Minoans built complex multi-story palaces with colorful frescoes and even had advanced plumbing. Their script, Linear A, is still undeciphered, hinting at sophisticated administration. Critically, their civilization suffered a massive blow when the volcanic island of Thera Santorini erupted catastrophically around 1600 BC, one of the largest eruptions in recorded prehistory. This eruption blasted apart Santorini, a thriving Minoan city that was buried under volcanic ash, much like Pompeii under Vesuvius, and likely caused huge tsunamis that struck Crete and other areas. The Minoans were crippled, and not long after, their society collapsed, likely finished off by Mycenaean Greek invaders. The timing isn't anywhere close to Plato's 9600 BC date. It's much later. But some scholars in the 20th century thought the Thera eruption could have inspired an Egyptian tale about an island sinking, which then found its way to Plato's ears. After all, Santorini's caldera, the sea-filled volcanic crater that remains, is literally a ring of islands, not unlike Atlantis's concentric rings in Plato's story. And the Minoans, with their fleet and prosperous cities, could be seen as a smaller-scale prototype of Atlantis's glory and sudden destruction by nature. If you ever visit Santorini, and I hope you get the chance, it's a stunning place. Standing on the cliff edge, looking into that deep blue flooded caldera, you can feel the weight of history and catastrophe there. I remember gazing at the sunset painting the caldera golden and thinking, under those waves lie the ruins of Akrotiri, the Minoan city, still being excavated from the hardened ash. It gave me chills to imagine that perhaps this real event, an advanced island civilization obliterated by natural disaster, echoed across time into Plato's legend, a satellite view of Santorini's caldera, the aftermath of the ancient eruption that some believe inspired the Atlantis myth. The island's outer ring and submerged center hint at how a thriving Bronze Age world might vanish in a fury of nature. It's like stumbling upon a plausible skeleton of truth inside the myth. Many find the Santorini hypothesis compelling because it doesn't require inventing unknown continents or super technologies. It connects the Atlantis story to an actual historical event, just shifted in time and scaled up a bit in the telling. Whether Plato really had Thera in mind via Egyptian sources or not, we can't be sure. but it's one of the more reasonable theories. Moving westward, there's another interesting possibility. Tartessos, a wealthy trading city mentioned in ancient Greek and Hebrew sources, thought to have been somewhere in southern Spain. Andalusia, Tartessos, which vanished from records around 500 BC. Herodotus described Tartessos as a rich kingdom beyond the Pillars of Heracles. Almost an Iberian Atlantis has been proposed as a cultural memory behind Plato's tale. This gained traction when researchers noted that the marshy lands of the Doñana National Park near Spain's Atlantic coast showed traces of ancient human activity and possible geometric structures. In 2011, a team led by a professor named Richard Freund in a documentary for National Geographic Channel claimed to have identified circular forms in the swamps that resembled Atlantis's rings. They suggested that maybe a tsunami had destroyed a city there, and survivors built memorial Atlantis-like cities farther inland in Spain. It sounded exciting, an actual archaeological find that could tie to Atlantis. However, Spanish archaeologists who work on that region were not convinced. In fact, they criticized the claim, pointing out that those circular features could be anything, and that Freund's team might be seeing what they want to see. One anthropologist involved said that Freund sensationalized their findings and called the Atlantis connection fanciful. In other words, the jury is very much still out and leaning toward disbelief. No definitive Atlantean city was pulled from the marshes, at least not yet, heading out beyond the Pillars of Heracles into the Atlantic itself. Numerous locations have been proposed. The Azores, a cluster of islands far west of Portugal, have sometimes been thought of as mountaintops of Atlantis. Indeed, if you look at a map of the Atlantic seafloor, you'll see the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a great undersea mountain range, and one could imagine that maybe parts of it were above water long ago. Some early 20th century expeditions dredged up what they claimed were ancient carved stones from deep Atlantic waters, but such finds have been either discredited or never verified. Modern geology has a sobering insight. An island as large as Libya and Asia, basically a continent-sized land, simply could not have existed in the Atlantic and then disappeared without a trace in the span of 10, 00, or even 100, 00 years. The plate tectonics revolution in the mid-20th century taught us that continents don't just sink. The ocean floors and continents are parts of plates that move extremely slowly over millions of years, not things that can just crumble and vanish. So the classic sunken continent idea of Atlantis became highly implausible in light of science. That hasn't stopped believers from pointing to smaller features. For instance, the submerged Spartel Bank near Gibraltar, which was flooded about 0 years ago by rising sea levels, has been suggested as a candidate for the island. It's tiny compared to Plato's Atlantis, but you can see the appeal of the timing aligning with the end of the Ice Age. Across the Mediterranean and Atlantic, the list of proposed sites is almost endless. Malta, Sardinia, Crete, Sicily, Cyprus. Basically, any island or sunken shoal in the Med has been at one point someone's Atlantis. Northern Europe has entries too. The North Sea had a prehistoric lost land called Doggerland that was inundated around 6000 BC. And indeed, Doggerland was real. An extensive plain that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, home to Stone Age peoples. Some tabloids even dub it Britain's Atlantis. But there were no grand stone cities on Doggerland. It disappeared long before the rise of any advanced architecture or writing, drowned gradually by post-glacial sea rise and possibly a tsunami from the Storegga slide. It's a sobering example that while lands do get swallowed by the sea, especially with the end of ice ages, those events happened in deep prehistory to hunter-gatherer territories, not glittering marble kingdoms. One of the more imaginative modern theories places Atlantis in an entirely different setting, the Sahara Desert. Yes, on land, not underwater. This theory zeroes in on the Rishat structure in Mauritania, nicknamed the Eye of the Sahara. Seen from space, the Rishat is a striking series of concentric circles, spanning about 40 kilometers. It looks uncannily like a giant target, or an enormous set of rings etched into the desert. Internet sleuths noted that if you squint, some aspects of it roughly match Plato's Atlantis descriptions: circular rings, a mountain to the north, an opening that could be interpreted as a former river or seaway. Could it be that Atlantis was actually an inland city that was later consumed by the desert? Enthusiasts have pointed out that the Risha structure's diameter is not too far off from what Plato described for Atlantis's central city area. This hypothesis gained a lot of traction on YouTube and social media in recent years. However, geologists who have studied the Rishat structure have a clear opinion. It's a natural formation, basically a dome of rock uplift that eroded over time into concentric rings, and archaeologists have found no evidence of an ancient city there at all. No pottery, no ruins, nothing to indicate humans built anything in those rings. It appears the Risha was never inhabited by a city, only sporadically visited by nomadic tribes. It's a case of a gorgeous geological oddity firing up the imagination. A fun what-if, but ultimately unsupported by hard evidence, a satellite-derived image of the Rishat structure. The Eye of the Sahara in Mauritania. Its concentric rings have been speculated by some to be the remains of Atlantis's capital, though no archaeological evidence has been found there. This striking feature is entirely natural, a reminder that not every ring in the sand hides a lost city. And then there's the tale of the Bimini Road, which we touched on earlier when mentioning Edgar Cayce. In September 1968, off the coast of Bimini Island in the Bahamas, divers found an underwater formation of neatly aligned rectangular limestone blocks lying in about 5 to 7 meters of clear water. It looked remarkably like an ancient road or wall on the seabed. This made headlines. Could it be a road from sunken Atlantis? The timing was eerie. It was 1968, the very year Cayce's reading had predicted Atlantis would start to be found near Bimini. Excitement bubbled up among believers that this was a sign. However, geological examination has since shown that the Bimini Road is a natural feature. The stones are local beach rock that fractured in place and eroded in straight lines, a phenomenon well known in geology. Radiocarbon dating indicated the formation is only a couple of thousand years old, not remotely 11,000 years. So, no lost Bronze Age highway there, just Mother Nature playing architect. Still, the Bimini discovery is almost symbolic in the Atlantis story. It shows how even a mundane natural find can be swept into the powerful current of the Atlantis myth and come out imbued with mystery, especially when coincidences like Cayce's prediction fuel the flame. In another case, in 2001, a research expedition using sonar off the western coast of Cuba reported detecting symmetrical rock formations deep under the ocean, around 600-700 meters down. This news sparked excitement about a possible sunken city in the Caribbean. If true, such ruins would be stunning. lying at depths that would have been dry land during the last ice age, roughly aligning with Atlantis's time frame. However, no concrete evidence beyond the sonar images has ever been obtained. Many scientists suspect the formations, while curious, are natural. For example, an unusual arrangement of coral or rock outcrops. The Cuban underwater ruins remain an unsolved curiosity, but experience teaches us to be cautious. Atlantis has teased us with many mirages like this. Through all these searches, expeditions, and conjectures, something becomes clear. No one has found unequivocal evidence of Atlantis. Many false alarms. Many could be, if you wish, really hard scenarios, but nothing that makes the scientific community say, yes, this matches Plato's Atlantis, and we found it. And given what we know about history and geology, many scholars assert that Atlantis was always meant to be allegorical, a legend, not a lost chapter of genuine history. But that doesn't stop people from looking. Part of the allure is exactly that lack of proof. It leaves a blank canvas for each new generation to project their own ideas upon. And I'll admit, even knowing the odds, I've had my moments, like poring over Google Earth's bathymetric maps of the Atlantic, hoping my amateur eyes might catch a city-shaped blur on the ocean floor that everyone else missed. No luck, of course. All I got were some peculiar seafloor patterns that turned out to be data glitches. We can hardly resist the pull of a good mystery. As we recount these quests and hypotheses, I feel a mix of skepticism and childlike hope. On one hand, the rational voice in me nods along with the scientists. Yes, it's likely a myth, and these far-flung theories have huge holes. On the other hand, there's that inner adventurer, the kid who grew up reading Jules Verne and watching Indiana Jones, who whispers, but what if there was something real behind it all? It's the same part of us that gazes at the stars wondering about aliens, or that gets goosebumps in old ruins, sensing the echoes of the past. Atlantis lives in that tender place between knowledge and imagination. Before we leave the body of our narrative and move to the next act, our reality check, take a moment to appreciate just how much territory we've covered. A mystical island described in ancient Greece has led us on a tour from the Mediterranean to the Bahamas, from Spain's marshes to the plains of the Sahara, from rational scholarship to wild speculation. The Atlantis obsession has consumed lifetimes, filled libraries with books, and drawn countless people to the edges of maps, and sometimes to the edges of their wits. It's quite possible that the search for Atlantis tells us more about the searchers than about Atlantis itself. And that thought is the perfect bridge to step back and ask, what is real here and what is wishful thinking? All right, let's pause and breathe. We've indulged our imagination and traced the legend's footprint across time. Now comes the part where we gently turn on the lights and look at Atlantis with a clear, sober gaze. It's time for a reality check. What do we actually know, and what can we reasonably say about this tale? If we strip away the romance and adventure, does Atlantis hold up as a historical possibility, or does it crumble under scrutiny like a sandcastle at high tide? The honest answer, nearly all evidence, points to Atlantis being a myth, an invention of Plato's philosophical mind, rather than a lost chapter of history. Let's examine why virtually all serious scholars and many scientifically minded explorers, grudgingly or not, have reached this conclusion. We have mapped the ocean floors and the Earth's crust in great detail. If there had been a massive landmass or large island the size Plato described that sank in the Atlantic in the late Ice Age, the scars of that event should be visible. They're not. Geologists tell us that there simply is no place an Atlantis of that scale could have existed in the Atlantic or anywhere near in the time frame given, not without leaving behind some telltale sign like a sunken continental shelf or deposits of debris. Plate tectonics, as mentioned, doesn't allow for the sudden disappearance of large land masses. Continents aren't ice cubes that melt. They're more like giant pieces of a puzzle that move extremely slowly and may fragment, but don't just submerge entirely in a fell swoop. Sure, sea levels rose after the last ice age by hundreds of feet globally, and that did drown coastlines and even some small islands like Spartel near Gibraltar. But those floods happened gradually, or in pulses, over centuries, not in a single day and night, and they didn't erase entire land masses, leaving nothing. Moreover, any culture existing 600 years ago, 9600 BC, would have been prehistoric, typically nomadic or at best village-level societies just beginning to experiment with agriculture. We have plenty of evidence of human life from that period: cave paintings in Europe, hunter-gatherer camps, and even early settlements like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, and none of it suggests skyscraping bronze cities or globe-trotting navies. There's a hard cutoff in our archaeological record. The earliest true cities and advanced civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, etc. start around 4000, 3000 BC. A full-fledged empire in 9600 BC with ships and architecture is wildly out of sync with everything we know about human development. It would mean we lost an entire chapter of history, something extremely unlikely given all the evidence we do have of that era, which shows humanity in the Stone Age. If an empire as powerful as Atlantis really dominated large parts of Europe, Africa, and the Atlantic, and met a spectacular end, you'd expect multiple ancient cultures to remember it in some form. Yet, aside from Plato's dialogues and those who quoted or embellished him later, we have zero confirmed ancient records or inscriptions that clearly talk about Atlantis. The Egyptian records we have, and we have a lot from temple walls to papyri, do not mention Atlantis or anything like its story. Neither do Mesopotamian or other Mediterranean texts. Granted, absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, but this kind of silence is deafening. It strongly implies that Atlantis was unknown until Plato wrote about it. Contrast this with something like the Trojan War. Multiple Greek poets and storytellers referenced it, and even ancient Egyptians might have alluded to Achaeans Greeks fighting in the Aegean. For Atlantis, we have just the one source, Plato, who is known to have crafted allegorical stories elsewhere in his works. It's as if someone, 1,000 years from now, tried to prove Gotham City was real, based solely on Batman comics, without any other historical references. It doesn't mean Plato lied. He may have believed some older story, or simply used a narrative device. But it means we have to treat the Atlantis story with extreme caution as a singular, uncorroborated account. We should remember why Plato told the story. In his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, the story of Atlantis is not presented as a mystery or a factual chronicle. It's a device within a philosophical discussion. Plato was making a point about hubris and the virtues of an ideal society embodied by his beloved Athens. Atlantis was the antithesis of the virtuous society, wealthy, technologically advanced, and mighty. Yes, but also prideful and morally decayed. By contrasting the two, Plato wanted to show that moral and just living wins out over arrogance and imperial aggression. Understanding this context Many scholars conclude that Plato crafted Atlantis as a cautionary tale or a thought experiment, not as a historical report. Indeed, he emphasizes the true story angle perhaps as a literary technique. The way some modern novels begin with, based on a true story, to draw you in, even when the tale itself is invented. Julia Annas, a contemporary classical scholar, famously commented that the continuing industry of searching for Atlantis is a bit like missing the moral of a fable entirely. In her words, we have missed the point. If instead of thinking about these issues, we go off exploring the seabed, Plato wasn't trying to send future archaeologists on a treasure hunt. He was trying to get his readers, ancient Athenians, to reflect on ethics, power, and society. That doesn't prove Atlantis is made up, but it frames it more like a story with a purpose than a lost historical chapter. If we take Plato's account at face value, it has some issues when mapped onto reality. The size of Atlantis, bigger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, which to Plato's audience meant bigger than North Africa and Turkey combined, is huge. Nowhere in the Atlantic could an island that big hide, nor could it sink without a trace. The timeline of 900 years before Solon, roughly 9600 BC, predates any known naval or architectural capabilities by many millennia. The idea that Athens in the story, a Bronze Age level Athens with chariots and arms, existed as a city 9600 BC, in an ideal state, is completely at odds with archaeology. Athens in 9600 BC was just a location where some Neolithic people might have camped. Plato, of course, wouldn't have known that Greek thinkers of his time had no conception of prehistory as we do. They often conflated mythic time with real time. In essence, the tale as told doesn't fit in real timelines. It works as a mythic, once-upon-a-time tale of a conflict between Proto-Athens and Atlantis, but not as a chapter of actual history as we understand it now. And on a smaller note, if Atlantis had indeed conquered parts of Europe and Africa, as Plato says, we would expect some cultural influence or artifacts left behind in those regions. There is no clear sign of that. Bronze Age and earlier cultures show their own development patterns without a mysterious Atlantic influence. This is more about us than about ancient evidence, but it's important. Humans have a tendency to romanticize the past and to create stories that convey deeper truths or hopes. The idea that there was once a golden age or a paradise that was lost due to human folly is a recurring motif. Worldwide, think of the Garden of Eden or countless flood myths where an earlier world is wiped out. Atlantis hits those notes perfectly. It's like an echo of our collective longing for a better time or advanced wisdom, and our collective guilt or fear of hubris leading to ruin. Because of this psychological appeal, Atlantis triggers a kind of wishful thinking. People want it to be true, and that can cloud judgment. It's telling that many Atlantis discoveries come from folks who admittedly started with a belief and then looked for proof, rather than from dispassionate researchers stumbling on evidence that led them to an Atlantis-like conclusion. I say this not to disparage the sincere explorers. Curiosity is a wonderful engine, but to highlight that Atlantis often lives in the realm of belief more than empirical discovery. Even scientists are not immune to the charm of a good story. Occasionally, you'll see a reputable person get drawn into Atlantis speculation because it's just so tantalizing, even though the rigorous evidence isn't there. Given all these points, the most straightforward conclusion is that Atlantis was a story, perhaps inspired by bits and pieces of real events, but not a real place. It was likely a synthesis of various inputs. The vastness of the Atlantic Ocean to Greeks a mysterious frontier, vague knowledge of ancient floods. Many cultures have flood myths and real disasters, like the sinking of Helike in Greece, 373 BC, that showed even cities could suddenly vanish. Plato could have taken these ingredients and, with a dash of creative genius, cooked up the grand tale of Atlantis to serve his philosophical message. Now, does this mean the case is closed and we should never speak of Atlantis again except as a metaphor? Not at all. While the consensus is that Atlantis is not historical, the value of the story and the exploration it inspires isn't lost. For one, it serves as a powerful moral tale about hubris, a reminder that no matter how advanced a society becomes, it cannot survive without virtue. Some see in Atlantis a warning about environmental disaster or divine wrath. Modern parallels might even be drawn to concerns about climate change or nuclear war. Will our advanced civilization meet a self-inflicted doom? Moreover, sometimes pursuing a myth leads to real discoveries in roundabout ways. The legend of Troy led Schliemann to Hisarlik, where he did find a real ancient city. The obsession with biblical floods led geologists to investigate the Black Sea flood around 5600 BC. In Atlantis's case, people have mapped the ocean floor more thoroughly, studied paleoclimate, and examined submerged settlements, all beneficial scientific endeavors, even if Atlantis itself remains unfound. Even today, best-selling authors and TV shows toy with the idea that an advanced Ice Age civilization existed, a kind of Atlantis, without the name, that was wiped out by global cataclysm around 10,000 BC. They point to things like the sudden sea level rise, mysterious ancient monuments like Göbekli Tepe, or the ubiquity of flood legends as hints. Mainstream science remains unconvinced, seeing these as either coincidental or explainable by known civilizations. But the popularity of such ideas shows the allure of Atlantis is still with us. People gravitate to the notion that something big might have happened in our prehistory that we haven't fully discovered. It's basically the Atlantis narrative dressed in new clothes, still casting a spell from beyond history. There's also a small possibility that a real event loosely akin to Atlantis might yet be discovered. Say, evidence of a significant sunken island civilization from the Bronze Age that we didn't know about. If that ever happens, you can bet it will be trumpeted as Atlantis found, even if, technically, it's something else. And that's fine. Really, Atlantis has become a symbol, a shorthand for any spectacular lost world. In a sense, Atlantis is immortal as an idea. Even if its physical reality is dubious, it will continue to inspire novels, movies, and yes, late-night conversations like this, long after we're gone. In giving this reality check, I feel a bit like the bearer of bad news, that friend who gently tells you that the exciting rumor you heard isn't true. And I'll admit, as a storyteller, part of me was reluctant to pop the bubble, but an honest, Zen-like view requires embracing truth even when it's less enchanting than fiction. Often, understanding the truth behind a myth can still be deeply satisfying. When we see Atlantis for what it likely is, a brilliant ancient parable, we can appreciate Plato's genius and the rich tapestry of meaning he wove, instead of just pining for literal sunken treasure. So, where do we stand? We stand with our feet on solid ground, recognizing that Atlantis probably never existed as a real empire. Yet, we also stand at the edge of a vast ocean of human imagination that Atlantis represents. And that view is still awe-inspiring in its own way. So, Where does this leave us? Here, at the end of our long midnight voyage, we set out chasing a mirage in the moonlight, the lost city of Atlantis, only to find that the journey was the real destination all along. The city itself, as we've reasoned, is most likely a myth, but the meaning of Atlantis, that's something very real and very potent. Atlantis is a story about hubris, about the fall of a great civilization that forgot its morals and fell out of harmony with the cosmos. In that sense, it's a timeless cautionary tale. Think of every empire or superpower in history. How many believed they were invincible, only to decline or collapse due to arrogance or complacency? Atlantis resonates as a metaphor for any society, even potentially our own, that might fly too close to the sun. There's a sobering lesson. Technology and wealth can't save you if wisdom and humility are lost. Whether it was Atlantis sinking, or Rome burning, or any number of historical reckonings, the story reminds us that no paradise is permanent if corruption sets in. But there's another side to our fascination. It's not all caution and doom. Atlantis also embodies our yearning for lost utopias. We humans have this deep-seated feeling that maybe somewhere in the distant past, we got it right. That there was a golden age when people lived in harmony with nature and each other, when knowledge was profound and life almost magical. It's a bit of a spiritual ache, a nostalgia for something we never actually experience but collectively dream about. Atlantis, as often portrayed in modern lore, ticks that box. An advanced, enlightened society, at least in some retellings, that tragically disappeared. It's the same tug we feel when we hear about Eden or Camelot or Shangri-La. A wishful thought that perfection existed and might be found again. There's also the allure of the unknown, admit it. Even after all the evidence against a literal Atlantis, a tiny part of you might still whisper, but maybe, somewhere, some remnant lies undiscovered. And that whisper isn't foolish. It's profoundly human. It's the curiosity that drove explorers across oceans and drives scientists to probe the depths of space. It's the spark that makes us look up at the stars and imagine other worlds, and look into the ocean and imagine sunken ones. Atlantis, as a mystery, keeps our sense of wonder alive, as long as a question mark hovers over the map or under the waves. We have a reason to explore, to question, to learn. In a way, Atlantis is a mirror. It reflects whatever we crave or fear. In the Cold War era, people wrote about Atlantis with death rays and super weapons mirroring nuclear anxieties. In eco-conscious times, we imagine Atlanteans living in harmony with crystal energies. Or conversely, Atlantis sinking as a warning about environmental catastrophe. We project onto Atlantis our highest aspirations and our darkest warnings. From a more intimate perspective, thinking about Atlantis can also be a meditation on loss and letting go. The image of an entire world vanishing beneath waves is hauntingly beautiful and sad. It makes us reflect on impermanence. How even the mightiest things can be fragile and transient. It's almost Zen. Cities, like San Mandalas, can be swept away in an instant. What matters then? Perhaps the story of Atlantis nudges us to cherish what we have now, to not take our own little islands of life for granted, because nothing in this world is unsinkable. We're reminded that nature can be both generative and merciless, and that human achievements, no matter how grand, are part of a larger, unpredictable tapestry. Now, as we sit here in the quiet hours, think back to that dark ocean we imagined at the start, the one where something stirred beneath the waves. Perhaps that something was never a marble temple or a crystal pyramid after all. Perhaps it was a reflection of our own hopes and fears, Bobbing on the surface of our subconscious, the lost city of Atlantis may not be waiting for us in some physical location, but it lives in our collective imagination, beckoning, challenging, inspiring. I find that strangely comforting. It means Atlantis is wherever we ponder big questions about how societies thrive or fail, about how knowledge can be lost or preserved, about the undiscovered frontiers of our world and within ourselves. In a sense, Atlantis is with us whenever we dream about the past or the future. It's a story that we keep writing, each generation adding its own chapter. Whether through scholarly debate, wild fantasy, or philosophical reflection. And so, our story comes to a close, but not a tidy, final close, more like an open-ended ending, the kind that leaves you gazing out to sea, mind full of possibilities. We may never get a definitive answer to Atlantis, and maybe that's for the best, because as long as Atlantis remains a mystery, it will continue to serve as a canvas for ideas and a catalyst for discovery. Next time you find yourself near a shore, or looking at a map of the ocean, or even playing a video game that involves a hidden underwater world, and the thought of Atlantis crosses your mind, smile at it. You're participating in a human tradition of wonder that's been going strong since Plato's dinner party over 2,000 years ago. Real or myth, in the end, Atlantis is as real as the power it has over our imaginations, and as mythical as the deeper truths wrapped in its story. Before we part, I want to thank you for sailing with me on this long journey. It's been a pleasure to wander through history, misfun, and meaning in your company. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Does Atlantis spark anything particular in you? A feeling, a theory, a daydream? Do you lean towards believing there is some lost civilization out there waiting to be found? Or are you firmly in the, it's just a myth, but a great one camp? Let me know in the comments. After all, the legend of Atlantis lives on through our continued fascination and the conversations we share. As for the time, perhaps it's very late for you, or very early. The night has a way of making these reflections feel even more poignant. Wherever you are, I hope this story leaves you with a sense of wonder and a gentle reminder of both the fragility and the resilience of human dreams. We may not have Atlantis in reality, but we have the idea of it. And sometimes an idea can be just as powerful. Thank you for listening, and until our next journey, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep that inner light burning bright. Good night, and safe travels in all your explorations, whether they be across the world or within your own heart.